The neon lights of the roadside diner flickered against the darkening sky as the last bit of sunlight bled over the horizon. Inside, the low hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of coffee cups and the faint murmur of a radio playing an old country song. It was the kind of place that had been around for decades. Worn booths, a counter that had seen its fair share of elbows, and regulars who had long since become part of the furniture. At a corner booth, Hank Grizzly Lawson sat with his usual order, a black coffee and a slice of apple pie, his old, weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic mug, fingers scarred from a lifetime of war and hard work. The man was 90 years old, but his presence still carried weight, the kind that made people straighten their backs when they spoke to him. He wasn't just some old-timer, he was a veteran, a survivor of 2 wars, a man who had seen things that would make most men crumble. Most people in town knew better than to bother him, but not tonight. The first sign of trouble came with the distant rumble of engines, growing louder by the second. A few patrons glanced toward the window, the sound rolling in like a thunderstorm. The diner's waitress, Rachel, barely out of high school, hesitated near the counter, her fingers gripping the notepad a little tighter. Then the bikers arrived. The door swung open hard, making the bell above it jangle violently. 5 of them, all leather jackets, tattoos, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been put in their place. They weren't just passing through, they were looking to own the room. They took a booth near the counter, laughing too loud, talking too big, the kind of noise that demanded attention. A few regulars lowered their heads, trying to ignore them. The waitress approached, forcing a polite smile, but before she could ask for their orders, one of them grabbed the menu from her hands, making her stumble back slightly. The leader, a lean, sharp-jawed guy with too much swagger, smirked as he looked around the diner. His eyes landed on Grizzly. "Look at this," he said, nudging the guy next to him. "Old war hero, huh?" Grizzly didn't acknowledge him. The biker wasn't used to being ignored. He stood up, walking over, boots heavy on the tile floor. "You got a lot of stripes on that jacket, Grandpa," he said, nodding toward the military patches on Grizzly's faded bomber jacket. "Bet you got some real stories, huh?" Grizzly kept sipping his coffee. The biker's smirk twitched, his patience wearing thin. "What's wrong, old man?" he pressed. "You deaf?" A couple of the bikers laughed, their voices dripping with mockery. Grizzly finally looked up. His eyes were steady, cold, the kind of eyes that had seen war and never forgotten it. "Not deaf," he said. His voice was gravelly, quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. "Just not interested." The laughter at the bikers' table died down. The leader's smirk faded for just a second before he forced it back. "That right?" he asked, resting a hand on Grizzly's table, his fingers drumming against the surface. Grizzly didn't blink. The biker exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Man, you old guys are all the same. Think you deserve respect just 'cause you lived longer." He reached out and snatched the military cap off Grizzly's head. A silence hit the diner like a gunshot. Rachel gasped, the other customers froze. Even Joe, the diner owner, took a step forward like he was about to say something. But Grizzly? He didn't move. The biker twirled the cap in his fingers. "You got a lot of dust on this thing, old man," he said, pretending to examine it. "Bet it's been a long time since you did anything but tell stories about the good old days." Grizzly's fingers drummed once against the table. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. The biker's smile widened, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Was the old man reaching for something? A weapon? Grizzly pulled out something much smaller. An old flip phone. The biker snorted, shaking his head. "Oh, come on," he said, turning to his crew. "What's he gonna do? Call his grandkids?" The others laughed again, but this time it was a little forced. Grizzly flipped the phone open, pressed a button, and brought it to his ear. He spoke only 6 words. "It's Grizzly. I need a favor." Then he closed the phone and set it on the table, going back to his coffee like nothing had happened. The bikers stared. The leader tilted his head, his smirk returning. "That's supposed to scare me, old man?" Grizzly didn't answer, didn't even look at him. The biker glanced toward his crew, shrugging like this was all just a joke. "Guess we'll just have to teach you some." Then he heard it. A sound low and distant like the first rumble of an approaching storm. Engines. Lots of them. The laughter stopped. The biker turned toward the window, just as headlights pierced through the darkness, rolling in, slow and deliberate. Not just motorcycles, trucks, SUVs, military-grade vehicles. One by one, they lined the street, forming a wall of steel and roaring engines outside the diner. The leader of the bikers stepped back, his cocky expression now laced with something else, uncertainty. The diner door swung open. The first man who walked in was built like a tank, his frame thick with muscle, his beard streaked with gray. His jacket bore a simple insignia, a Special Forces patch. More men followed behind him, older, harder, weathered by time, but still dangerous as hell. Some wore leather vests with veteran biker patches. Others had the unmistakable look of men who had once lived their lives in war zones. The leader of the group, Duke, stopped just inside the doorway, scanning the room before locking eyes with Grizzly. "You good?" Duke's voice was calm, but it carried weight. Grizzly set his coffee down. "Yeah," he said, "but these boys here seem to have forgotten their manners." The bikers froze. The leader let out a nervous laugh, trying to act like he still had control. Hey, we were just messing around, man." Duke's expression didn't change. "You boys should leave," he said. The biker licked his lips, glancing at the men who had just walked in. "Right now," Duke added. And that was when the biker realized the truth. He had mocked the wrong man. The diner felt smaller now. The laughter had died. The cocky smirks had vanished. The air had changed, thick and heavy, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. The young bikers, so full of themselves just a minute ago, were now frozen in place, their bravado cracking under the weight of the men who had just walked in. Duke Hollister stood at the front, his presence as solid as a wall. The former Special Forces operative, built like a bear and twice as mean, didn't move fast or raise his voice. He didn't need to. His stillness alone was enough. Behind him, the rest of the men filled the diner, a unit without uniforms, but no one needed patches or medals to see exactly what they were. They were fighters, warriors, men who had been forged in combat and never quite left the battlefield behind. The leader of the bikers, the same punk who had swiped Grizzly's cap, swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his sides, as if his body hadn't caught up with his brain yet, still trying to decide if he should fight or run. Grizzly watched it all with calm amusement, his coffee cup still warm in his hand. He had seen this before, the moment when a loudmouth realizes he's out of his depth. Duke took a step forward, his boots heavy on the tile floor, and the biker kid flinched. "You boys should leave," Duke said again, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a command. The biker leader let out a forced laugh, trying to salvage some pride. "Hey, look, man, we weren't trying to start anything. We were just..." Duke raised his hand slightly. The biker stopped talking. "You weren't trying to start anything?" Duke repeated, tilting his head. "Because, from what I heard, you walked in here like you owned the place. Disrespected this man. Took his hat." He nodded toward Grizzly, who was still sipping his coffee, completely at ease. The biker shifted uncomfortably. His men weren't backing him up, not anymore. "You ever served, son?" Duke asked, his voice softer now, but somehow more dangerous. The biker shook his head, his Adam's apple bobbing. Duke nodded slowly. "Yeah, didn't think so." One of the older veterans in the back, a former Marine with arms like tree trunks, leaned forward. "You know what happens to men who don't show respect where we come from?" The biker didn't answer. The Marine smirked. "They learn." The leader wasn't smiling anymore. His whole body was coiled tight, his brain screaming at him to do something, anything. But there was nowhere to go. Duke exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "See, the problem with punks like you don't understand consequences. You go through life thinking no one's gonna check you, but every once in a while, you run into the wrong people." Grizzly finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You ran into the wrong people." The biker tensed, his face burning with humiliation. He could feel his crew looking at him, waiting to see what he would do. And for one stupid second, he thought about making a move. His hand twitched toward his belt, where a knife was tucked beneath his jacket. Duke saw it. So did Grizzly. So did every man in the room who had spent years learning how to spot a threat before it became one. And just like that, Duke moved. The biker didn't even have time to react. In one fluid motion, Duke closed the distance, grabbed the punk by the collar, and slammed him against the counter with enough force to rattle the dishes. The biker let out a choked grunt, his hands scrambling to push Duke away, but it was like fighting a mountain. Duke leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Reach for a weapon in front of me again, and I promise you won't be walking out of here." The biker's breath came fast and shallow, his eyes wide with something he wasn't used to feeling. Real fear. The diner was dead silent. The other bikers didn't move. They knew better. Duke held him there for a second longer, just to let the message sink in. Then he let go, stepping back. The biker staggered, his knees almost buckling. He caught himself on the counter, sucking in air like a drowning man who had just surfaced. Grizzly took another slow sip of coffee. "You done?" he asked, his voice as steady as ever. The biker nodded quickly, not trusting his own voice. "Good." Duke gestured toward the door. "Now get the hell out of here." The biker didn't hesitate. He turned and bolted, pushing past his crew without a word. The others scrambled after him, their boots slapping against the tile as they rushed out into the night. The engines outside roared to life, and within seconds the entire group was tearing out of town, their bravado left behind on the diner floor. Inside, the silence lingered, thick and heavy. Then Frank let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn, Duke, you're getting soft in your old age." Duke smirked, rubbing his knuckles. "Yeah, well, didn't want to break him too bad." Grizzly set his cup down, exhaling slowly. "They'll remember this." Joe, the diner owner, finally let out a breath. "Damn right they will." Rachel, the waitress, still had wide eyes, her hands gripping the counter. "I thought they weren't gonna do anything," Duke said, cutting her off. "Not to us." She swallowed hard. "How do you know?" Grizzly smiled, but there was something knowing behind it. "Because some men fight for power," he said simply, "and some men fight for something bigger." Rachel nodded slowly, the truth settling in. Duke turned to Grizzly. "Want to ride home?" Grizzly shook his head, grabbing his cane. "I can walk." Duke smirked. "Stubborn old bastard." Grizzly just smiled, stepping out into the night, where the world was quiet again. He had fought his wars. He had nothing left to prove, but if the world ever needed reminding, all it took was one phone call. The night stretched long and heavy outside the diner, the faint glow of taillights disappearing over the horizon. The roar of the bikers' engines had faded into silence, but inside the diner, the tension still clung to the air like smoke after a gunfight. Grizzly sat back in his booth, slow and measured, his old hands wrapping around his coffee cup once more. His heart rate hadn't changed, his pulse hadn't spiked. He had seen worse than this. A few disrespectful kids, that was nothing. Duke remained by the door, watching the street like a wolf scanning the tree line. Frank had settled back into his seat at the counter, shaking his head as he reached for his half-drained cup of coffee. The other veterans who had gathered in response to Grizzly's call, some ex-Marines, some old Army Rangers, a couple of airborne boys, remained seated, calm but coiled like loaded springs. They didn't need to speak. They understood what had just happened. The kids had learned a lesson, but the night wasn't done. Rachel, the young waitress, still looked shaken. She stood behind the counter, her hands pressed against the edge as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She had grown up in a world where violence was something that happened on TV, not inside a quiet diner in the middle of nowhere. Joe, the owner, let out a low breath and tossed his rag over his shoulder. "You know, Grizzly, I was real close to banning you from this place." Grizzly smirked, lifting his cup to his lips. "No, you weren't." Joe sighed. "Yeah, well, would have been a stupid decision anyway." The small group of regulars in the diner started to ease back into conversation, but the unease hadn't completely left. Everyone knew those bikers weren't the type to let this go easily. Rachel finally spoke, her voice hesitant, her eyes darting between Duke and Grizzly. Are they gonna come back?" Duke was the first to answer. "Maybe, but if they do, they won't like what's waiting for them." Grizzly exhaled through his nose. He wasn't worried, but he also wasn't stupid. He knew when men like that got embarrassed, they either ran or retaliated. And something about the way the leader had flinched, the way his fingers had itched toward his belt before he backed down. That wasn't the look of a man who was finished. Frank downed the rest of his coffee in one gulp and set the cup down with a decisive clink. "Well, if they do come back, I hope they bring some better fighters. 'Cause I damn near fell asleep last time." That got a few chuckles from the veterans at the counter, but Duke didn't smile. His fingers drummed lightly against his thigh, his instincts still on edge. "They'll bring more numbers," he said flatly, "and they'll bring something extra." Joe muttered under his breath, running a hand through his graying hair. "For God's sake, this town doesn't need another bar fight spilling into the streets." Grizzly set his cup down gently, his fingers curling around his cane. He wasn't moving yet, but the room knew he was thinking, calculating, the way he always had. "They won't start a fight in town," Grizzly said after a moment. "Too many people watching, too many things to lose." He tilted his head slightly toward Duke. "But they'll wait. They'll wait until they think we're vulnerable. Then they'll strike." Duke nodded. "That's what I'd do." Rachel paled slightly. "But why? You already let them go. Why come back?" Grizzly finally met her eyes. "Because they don't want to win. They want revenge." The word hung in the air like a bitter taste. Duke shifted his weight slightly, his fingers twitching near his belt. "We should leave in pairs. No one goes alone." Grizzly exhaled. "Not necessary." Frank let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, right. You really think those kids are just gonna lick their wounds and move on?" Grizzly smirked, shaking his head. I think they're gonna come looking for a fight." He glanced down at his cane, then back up at Duke. "And I think we should give them one." The room went quiet again. Duke cracked his neck, rolling his shoulders. "I knew I liked you, old man." Rachel swallowed hard. "So, what do we do?" Grizzly set his coffee cup down, wiped his hands on a napkin, and stood. "We set the trap." Joe groaned. "Oh, Jesus, Grizzly, not again." Frank grinned. "I like the sound of this." Grizzly turned toward the door, stepping slowly but deliberately. "Duke, you take your guys. Follow them out of town, watch where they go. I want to know if they're meeting up with anyone." Duke nodded. "On it. Frank, you stick with me. I got a feeling they won't be patient for long." Frank smirked, pushing back his chair. "You mean we're gonna make sure they don't have time to think?" Grizzly's lips twitched in amusement. "Something like that." Rachel's voice came out hesitant. But what if they have guns?" Grizzly turned to her, his expression calm, steady, unshaken. "Then they're even dumber than I thought." Without another word, the veterans stood, moving like men who had spent their whole lives walking into danger without a second thought. They weren't running from the fight. They were going straight toward it. And by the time those bikers realized their mistake, it would already be too late. Because this wasn't their battlefield. This was Grizzly's. The cold desert wind howled through the empty streets as Grizzly stepped out of the diner, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. The others followed, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of men who had nothing left to prove but still knew how to handle a fight. The neon glow from the diner's sign buzzed faintly in the background, casting flickering shadows on the cracked pavement. Duke's truck was parked nearby, the engine humming low, ready to roll out at a moment's notice. He leaned against the hood, watching Grizzly approach. The old man's expression was unreadable, but Duke had known him long enough to know that the wheels in his head were turning. "They're holed up just outside town," Duke said, pushing off the truck. "Old gas station on Route 6. Looks like they called in some backup." Grizzly nodded, taking it in without surprise. He had expected them to regroup, to gather more men. That was how men like them operated: numbers, noise, and intimidation. Frank let out a sharp laugh, crossing his arms. "I'm guessing they didn't just stop for gas." Duke shook his head. "Nah, they're pissed. One of them was pacing outside, smoking like a damn chimney. Their leader, Scarface, he's inside, making calls." Grizzly exhaled through his nose. He could picture it already. Scarface, still nursing the sting of humiliation, still reeling from the fact that a 90-year-old man had put him in his place without throwing a single punch. The kid's pride was wounded, and that made him dangerous. He wasn't thinking straight. "Good. We go in fast," Grizzly said, adjusting his stance. "Before they get the chance to get comfortable." Duke nodded, rubbing his jaw. "You want us to hit them head on?" Grizzly smirked. "No, we let them think they've got the advantage first." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Always did like your style, old man." Grizzly ignored him, already moving toward the truck. The rest of the veterans followed, their movements calm, precise. men who had done this before. The drive out to the gas station was quiet, the tension thick but controlled. No one spoke much. There was no need. This wasn't some reckless bar fight. This was a controlled engagement, a lesson that needed to be taught. The gas station was dimly lit, a single overhead bulb buzzing above the abandoned pumps. The bikes were lined up outside in a loose formation, their chrome glinting under the flickering fluorescent lights. The black truck from earlier was parked near the side of the building, its windows tinted, its presence heavy with implied threats. Inside, the shadows moved, figures pacing, voices low but agitated. Grizzly and his crew didn't rush. They let the scene unfold, let the enemy settle into their false sense of security. Then they made their move. Duke and two others took the side entrance, moving quietly through the shadows. Frank and Grizzly walked straight through the front, the bell above the door jingling softly as they stepped inside. Scarface was leaning over the counter, barking something into his phone. A half-empty beer bottle rested beside him, his fingers tapping restlessly on the glass. His eyes snapped up the moment they entered. For half a second, he froze. Then his face twisted with rage. "You got some nerve walking in here, old man," he spat, slamming his phone onto the counter. His crew, about 7 of them, straightened in their seats, their hands twitching toward their belts, where knives and pistols waited. Grizzly didn't blink. "Figured we should finish our conversation," he said calmly, stepping forward. "Unless you're not man enough to do that?" Scarface's lip curled, but the hesitation was there now. His crew was watching him. He had something to prove. The moment stretched. Then, in a flash of stupid, reckless bravado, Scarface lunged. Grizzly had already moved. He sidestepped the wild swing with the kind of fluid grace that came from a lifetime of knowing how fights played out. Before Scarface could recover, Grizzly's cane whipped around, cracking against the back of his knee with pinpoint precision. Scarface crumpled, letting out a sharp grunt of pain as he hit the floor hard. His crew started to move, but before they could even think about reaching for their weapons, Duke's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Try it," he said, stepping out from the shadows, his pistol already drawn, the hammer already cocked. The room froze. Scarface gasped from the floor, struggling to get up, but Grizzly planted his cane against his chest, keeping him down. "I told you," Grizzly said, his voice low, calm. "You picked the wrong man." The other bikers didn't move. Their eyes darted between Grizzly, Duke, and the veterans who had taken up strategic positions around the room. They were outgunned, outmatched, and completely surrounded. Grizzly leaned down slightly, his expression unreadable. "You ever been in a real fight, son?" Scarface's breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling fast. He didn't answer. Grizzly shook his head. Didn't think so. He finally stepped back, letting the younger man scramble to his feet. Scarface looked at his crew, but they weren't looking at him anymore. Their gazes were locked on the men who had just humiliated them without breaking a sweat. A silent message passed between them all. Scarface's jaw tightened. His pride was still screaming at him to do something, to save face, to take control. But there was nothing left to do, nothing left to say. Grizzly adjusted his jacket, taking a step toward the door. "Walk away," he said simply. "Don't come back." Scarface hesitated, but only for a second. Then, with a furious glare, he grabbed his phone off the counter and stormed past his men, shoving the door open so hard that it nearly snapped off the hinges. His crew followed, their boots pounding against the pavement as they climbed onto their bikes, their engines roaring to life. One by one, they sped off into the night, their headlights disappearing into the desert darkness. Inside, the room finally exhaled. Frank smirked, shaking his head. "Damn, Grizzly, you really do know how to make an exit." Duke holstered his pistol, exhaling. "I'll be surprised if they ever show their faces around here again." Grizzly just picked up a half-full beer from the counter, took a slow sip, and smirked. "Some men learn the easy way," he said, setting the bottle down. "Others need to be reminded." The night was quiet again, and Grizzly was still standing,